His name was Robert Aldred, and he had been working inside Buckingham Palace for 31 years without ever once touching anything he was not supposed to touch. That was the whole job, really. Not the standing, not the uniform, not the hours, which were long, or the silence, which was longer. The whole job was knowing exactly where the line was, and never once stepping over it. Robert had learned that on his very first week, from a man named Hargreaves, a sergeant with the shoulders of someone who had spent decades disagreeing with doors. Hargreaves had said exactly one useful thing in the 3 months Robert had worked under him, and that one thing was this: "Son, in this building, curiosity is a disciplinary matter." Robert had never forgotten it. He was 54 years old now, built like a man who had spent 3 decades standing in cold corridors and eating whatever was fastest at the end of a shift. His hair had gone mostly gray at the sides. He thought of it, privately, as the palace's fault, which was unfair but satisfying, and he had a way of walking that the younger staff called the glide, barely lifting his feet, barely making any noise. He had been doing it so long he didn't notice anymore, but it meant he could move through a room, and nobody would quite register that he had been there. His wife, Linda, called it his ghost walk. He called it Tuesday. He was from North Yorkshire originally, a small town that produced 2 things reliably: men who knew how to keep their mouths shut, and men who knew how to fix things quietly. Robert was both. He had come to London at 22, joined the household division at 23, and spent the next 3 decades learning that the inside of a palace is, in many ways, just a very large building full of things that need checking, corridors that need walking, and rules that need following. The grandness of it had worn off after about 6 months. Now it was just his workplace, the way a bakery is just a bakery if you've worked there long enough, even if there are chandeliers. He had served under Queen Elizabeth II for most of his career. He did not talk about her death. Not once, not to anyone, not in any words. That was not the Yorkshire way, exactly, but it was the palace way, and after 30 years the two had become the same thing inside him. When she died, on the 8th of September 2022, at Balmoral in the afternoon, Robert had been on rotation in London. He found out the way most of the staff found out. A message came through the proper channels, the appropriate tone, the appropriate language. Everything in the palace had its appropriate language. He had read the message. He had stood in the corridor for a moment. Then he had walked to the next checkpoint on his route and done his job. Nobody asked him how he felt about it. He would not have known what to say. What he could have said, if pressed, was this: 70 years is a long time for a person to be a fixed point. 70 years is long enough that the fixed point stops feeling like a person and starts feeling like a fact of life, like the weight of the building over you, like the particular way the light comes through the high windows at 4 in the afternoon in winter. And then the fixed point is gone, and the building is still there, and the light still comes through the windows the same way, and you keep walking the corridor, because the corridor needs walking, but something has gone out of it that you cannot name and probably should not try. He had not tried. He had kept walking the corridor. That was how he ended up, on a gray Tuesday morning in April of 2023, holding a clipboard in Camilla's private dressing rooms. It was a routine pre-coronation security sweep. The coronation of King Charles III was set for the 6th of May, less than 3 weeks away. The palace in those weeks was unlike itself. Normally there was a hum to the place, an orderly hum, the hum of a large institution going about its business in the correct order. But in the weeks before a coronation, the hum went up several notes. There were robe makers coming and going. There were representatives from Westminster Abbey. There were tailors and embroiderers and footmen carrying things carefully, and people having urgent conversations in doorways in hushed voices. The coronation of a British monarch had not happened in 70 years. Most of the people involved had never done this before. They were working from instructions left by people who were no longer alive to clarify them. Robert found all of this calming, actually. He was the one thing in the building that had not changed its pace. 2 hours on, 4 hours off. Check the rooms, confirm the inventory, note any discrepancy, file the form, move on. That was the job. That had always been the job. He did not need to understand why things were where they were. He only needed to note whether they were there. The dressing rooms assigned to Camilla, the queen consort, as she was then, were on the upper floors, in a corridor that Robert had walked probably 8,000 times. He did not count, but he had a sense of the number in the way that you develop a sense of anything you've done long enough. The corridor smelled the same as it always had: beeswax, old wood, and the particular blank smell of rooms that have good ventilation and very little sunlight. He checked in at the outer door at 9:30 in the morning. The rooms were quiet. Staff had been rotated out for the day. There was some kind of fitting happening later, and the robe makers from Ede and Ravenscroft, the old London tailoring house that had been making royal robes since before the building was even fully built, were expected in the afternoon. That meant the rooms were Robert's, at least for the morning. Just him and the furniture and his clipboard. He started northeast. He always started northeast. Hargreaves again. Always start the corner that gets the most morning light, because that's where things go wrong first, and you want to catch them early. Hargreaves had been dead for 11 years, and Robert still started northeast. The outer room was right: a dressing table, 2 chairs, a cabinet along the far wall. He checked everything against the list. Everything checked out. He made his tick marks. He moved through the connecting door into the second room. This room was larger. The walls had been fitted with bespoke wardrobes, floor to ceiling, pale wood, the kind of workmanship that you stopped noticing in a palace because everything was that kind of workmanship. And in the center of the room was a long, low table that would have been used for laying out garments during fittings. Robert walked the perimeter, checking. His pen moved in small, precise marks. His footsteps made almost no sound at all. He reached the far wall, behind a long garment rack that had been covered with a plain white dust sheet. The inventory said, 1 garment rack, temporary housing, pre-coronation alterations. 4 items listed. Robert pulled the sheet back slightly to count. Behind the rack, up against the wall, there was a box that should not have been there. He looked at it for a moment. He looked back at the clipboard. Then he looked at the box again. It was long, low, built from wood. Good wood, old wood. The kind that had darkened over decades and was smooth in a way that new wood never is. The brass catches along the front had turned to the color of a very old penny, that particular greenish-brown that brass goes when it has been near damp air for a long time. The whole thing had been pushed back behind the garment rack, partially covered by the dust sheet, positioned with the deliberateness of something that someone had placed there very carefully and expected someone else to know was there. It was not on his inventory. He checked the list 3 times. He was thorough. That was the job. The box was not on the list. He stood there with the clipboard and looked at the box and did not touch it yet. He did not touch things before he had noted them. That was the rule, and the rule was the rule whether or not anyone was watching, because 31 years of following rules when people were watching meant nothing if you stopped when they weren't. That was another Hargreaves thing, actually. Robert had a lot of Hargreaves in him, and he hadn't even liked the man. He wrote on the clipboard, "Unlogged item identified, wardrobe-type storage case, long form, cedar-lined probable, brass catches, position, behind dust-sheeted garment rack, northwest corner, not on inventory, physical inspection required." He clicked his pen, then he looked at the catches. The cedar-lined probable had been his instinct, and his instincts about wood and storage cases were not usually wrong. He had been around old palace storage long enough to know the difference between the cedar of a thing built in the 1970s and the cedar of a thing built before that. This cedar, and he was still not touching it yet, was old enough that the scent was deep inside the grain. Not the sharp top-note cedar smell that you got from new linings. Something underneath. Something that had been there long enough to become part of the wood. He thought about the cedar for longer than was strictly necessary. The cedar was a good thing to think about. Specific, knowable. He knew exactly what good cedar smelled like. He knew where this cedar probably came from, roughly. And he knew that someone had put it in this box a long time ago, and the box had been in careful storage since then. And now it was here, behind a dust sheet, in a room that was about to become very busy with robe makers. Right then, he reached forward and released the catches. They opened without any resistance at all, like they had been waiting. Inside the box, folded in tissue paper, There was crimson velvet. He did not touch it yet. He looked. The velvet was the color that you almost never see outside of very old, very cared-for things. Not the bright red of something new, not the faded red of something neglected, but that deep, wine-dark crimson that only happens when something has been made well and stored properly for a very long time. It was folded in a way that Robert recognized immediately as not the fold of a laundress. It was the fold of someone who understood the weight of the thing they were folding. Deliberate, precise, the kind of fold that knows the fabric will need to unfold correctly the first time and every time. He could see ermine at the edges, the white and the black of it, real ermine, the thick-piled trim of something ceremonial and significant. He stood there. He was aware, in the way you become aware of things when the room is very quiet, that the corridor outside was completely silent. No footsteps, no distant voices. The robe makers were not coming until the afternoon. The fitting staff were elsewhere. It was just him and the box and the velvet and the ermine and whatever this was. He put on the white cotton gloves that he kept in his breast pocket for exactly this kind of situation. Situations where you encounter something that might be significant and should not be handled without care. And he carefully lifted the top edge of the tissue paper. The robe unfolded just slightly under its own weight, 15 pounds. He would find out later that it weighed approximately 15 pounds. He did not know that yet. He knew it by the feel of it through the cotton gloves. The weight of it was not the weight of normal fabric. It was the weight of something that had been made with many layers and many people's work inside it. It was the weight of a thing that had taken a very long time to make. Elizabeth II's robe had been crafted from purple velvet, trimmed with ermine, decorated with 18 types of gold thread, seed pearls, crystals, and colored silks. The embroidery alone had taken a team of 12 people over 3,500 hours to complete. Wikipedia Robert did not know any of those numbers, but he felt something of them in the weight. He carefully laid the top layer back and looked at what was underneath the tissue. Gold embroidery. Thick and worked in such a way that you could see where different hands had been, different sections of it done by different people over the course of months. The pattern ran in two main directions. He couldn't see all of it from here. The robe was folded, but he could see enough to know that the embroidery was not decoration in the way that decoration usually is. It was narrative. It was record. Every thread of it meant something specific and had been put there by someone who knew what it meant. And then he saw the monogram, Ayr, just visible at the fold. The crowned cipher, Elizabeth II Regina. He had seen that monogram on the walls of this building for 31 years. He had seen it on letterheads and door handles and crest plates and the embossed corners of official documents. He had seen it on the robe of state in the display at Windsor Castle, that one time he had been taken through as part of a staff tour in 2022, the year of the Platinum Jubilee. He had stood in front of the display case, a foot away from the crimson velvet and the ermine, and he had looked at it with the polite attention of a man who has seen a great many impressive things and knows the appropriate facial expression for each of them. He had not felt anything in particular. He was feeling something now. He laid the tissue paper back exactly as he had found it. Then he sat with that feeling for a moment, without naming it, the way you sit with the feeling of a room going cold before you look for the open window. He sat with it and let it be unnamed, because naming it would have been a kind of loosening that he couldn't afford right now. In this room, alone with this box, at 9:30 in the morning with a clipboard and a pre-coronation sweep to finish. He had been standing in this building the day she died, not at Balmoral. In London, in this building. He had been doing a routine check in the East Wing when the message came through on the internal system, the right channels, the appropriate language. He had read it. He had stood in the corridor outside the East Wing for, he didn't know how long. Long enough that the light moved slightly. Not long enough that anyone would have noticed. Then he had gone to the next checkpoint on his route. Nobody had said anything to him. 2 days later he had a new posting. Different rooms, different rotation. Nobody explained. Nobody in a palace explained things to the people who kept it running. That was the understanding you walked in with, and either you were the kind of person who could live with that, or you weren't. And after 31 years Robert had become so thoroughly the kind of person who could live with it that he sometimes forgot he'd made that choice. It had just become the shape of him. He picked up the clipboard. He wrote, "Cedar-lined case confirmed. Contents: 1 robe, crimson velvet, ermine trim, gold embroidery, ear cipher visible, garment consistent with ceremonial robe of state, pre-existing royal collection. Case requires formal logging and assessment by senior household coordinator before pre-coronation use. Item in excellent condition, handled with cotton gloves only, no contact with bare skin." He looked at what he had written. It said nothing about the weight. It said nothing about the monogram. It said nothing about the feeling of the room going quiet in the way that rooms sometimes go quiet when you open something that has been closed for a very long time, and the air inside it is different from the air outside. That was correct. None of that belonged on a clipboard. None of that was inventory. None of that was his job. He closed the lid of the box and secured the brass catches. He replaced the dust sheet exactly as he had found it. He moved on to the next room. And finished the sweep the way he always finished. Northeast to southwest, every surface, every corner, every item checked against its entry on the list. And by the time he was done, the morning had moved on, and there were voices starting up in the corridor outside. The sound of the robe makers beginning to arrive, the sound of the building coming back to life around him. He handed the clipboard to the senior household coordinator, a woman named Henderson who had been in her role for 12 years and had the expression of someone who had seen everything and filed most of it. He pointed to the entry about the unlisted cedar case. She read it. She nodded. She said she would have it logged and assessed and the conservation team notified. "Ede and Ravenscroft will need to look at it before it moves anywhere," she said, in the tone of someone who already knew what it was. Robert waited to see if she would say more. She didn't. He nodded. He left. He thought about the cedar for the rest of the day. Not the robe. The cedar. The specific age of it. The depth of the smell. The way it had been in that box for long enough that the scent had become part of the wood itself. He thought about who had commissioned a box like that, and when, and whether the person was still alive, and whether they had known, when they chose that cedar, that it would still be doing its job 70 years later. Good cedar. Really very good cedar. That was what he told himself, walking the corridor back to the checkpoint. The cedar was excellent. Everything else was above his pay grade. The palace had its systems and its people and its channels, and Henderson had the clipboard now, and it was no longer his problem. He went back to his post. The days between that Tuesday and the coronation moved in the way that pre-coronation days moved. Faster than ordinary days, louder than ordinary days, full of people who had urgent things to carry from one room to another. The cedar case was logged. The conservation team came. The robe was sent to Ede and Ravenscroft, the same house that had made the original in 1953, for conservation work to prepare it for the ceremony. Robert heard this through the normal channels, the kind of institutional background noise that filters through a workplace if you've been there long enough to understand the frequencies. The court jeweler. He did not ask questions. He knew what the robe was now, not because anyone told him, but because he had 31 years of the palace in him, and a monogram that said "A ear," and he could put two things together, the same as anyone. The robe had originally been made for Queen Elizabeth II for her coronation on the 2nd of June, 1953, crafted from crimson velvet and kept in the royal collection ever since. Now it was to be conserved and adjusted for the ceremony, to be worn by Camilla as Queen Consort at Westminster Abbey on May the 6th. Today, calm 70 years. The robe had sat in its cedar-lined box for 70 years, or near enough, and now it was coming back out. He thought about that sometimes. Not obsessively, just the way you think about things that have a particular shape to them, the shape of something circular, something that has returned to where it started. The robe had been in the Abbey once, in 1953, on the woman who wore that monogram for the rest of her life. Now it was going back to the Abbey, different body, different name, different time, but the same robe, the same velvet, the same gold thread that 12 people had spent 3,500 hours putting into it. That was the thing about the palace, Robert thought. It kept things. It kept things that most places would have thrown away, or let go to auction, or packed into a storage unit that nobody checked for 20 years. The palace kept things because the palace understood, in the deep, institutional, not quite said way that the palace understood things, that keeping things was itself a form of meaning, that an object passed forward was a conversation across time, that a robe worn by one queen and kept carefully and then worn by the next queen was something that had no word for it in the language of an inventory form, but that existed nonetheless. He thought about this. He thought about it the way he thought about the cedar, with more focus than the thought probably deserved, because it was easier to think about than the other thing. The other thing was that he had served a woman for 30 years, and then she had died, and nobody had said anything to him about it, and then 2 days later he had a new rotation, and then 7 months later he was running a pre-coronation sweep for her successor, and the world had kept moving, the corridor kept needing walking, the forms kept needing filing, and somewhere in all of that he had misplaced the thing he had been carrying since September, the stone in the coat pocket, and he couldn't find it now. He could feel where it had been. He couldn't find the thing itself. He wondered sometimes if the palace was designed for that, if the building itself, the corridors that needed walking, the checkpoints that needed checking, the inventories that needed ticking, was designed to give people like him somewhere to put the weight of it. Not to take it away, just to give it somewhere to go. Probably not. Probably it was just a building. But it had kept the robe. The coronation happened on May the 6th, the way coronations happen, with enormous ceremony and very careful organization, and a building full of people who had been preparing for months. Robert was not in Westminster Abbey. He had a different posting that day. Routine palace security, the standard coverage for a major public event, the kind of work that keeps the building safe while everyone's attention is pointed somewhere else. He watched part of the ceremony on a screen in the staff area, in between rotation checks. He watched it in the detached way that people watch things they feel adjacent to but not quite inside. He watched Camilla arrive at Westminster Abbey. She wore the crimson velvet and ermine robe of state, the robe originally made for Queen Elizabeth's coronation, conserved and adjusted by Ede and Ravenscroft, as she arrived at the service. CNN, the screen was not large, the image was not perfect, but Robert could see the robe clearly enough. He could see the crimson of it. He could see the ermine at the edge. He could see, in the way you can see something when you have held it, even briefly, even through cotton gloves, the weight of it in the way it moved. The person standing next to him in the staff area said something like, "She looks well." Robert said, The ceremony continued. The robes had been built to be seen from a distance, from the high stone heights of an abbey, and they worked. They worked the way things work when they have been made by people who knew what they were making and why. The crimson against the stone of the building, the ermine catching the light, the gold embroidery, all 3,500 hours of it, doing its job without asking anyone to notice it, which is the best thing embroidery can do. He watched until his rotation check came up. Then he went back to the corridor. He ran his sweep the usual way, northeast to southwest. Every surface, every corner, every item checked against its entry on the list. He reached the northwest corner of the dressing room. The cedar box was gone, logged out, properly, to the conservation team. The garment rack was still there, the dust sheet over it, the same pale wood of the wardrobes, the same beeswax and old wood smell of the corridor. Robert looked at the corner for a moment. He made a tick on the clipboard. Item absent as expected. See prior log entry. Coronation use confirmed. He clicked his pen. He moved on. And here is the thing about Robert Aldred that nobody at the palace knew, because he had never said it to anyone, and did not intend to. He understood, in his bones, in the specific language of a man who has spent 31 years keeping a building safe and asking nothing in return, that finding the robe had been the right thing, not because he had done anything unusual with it. He hadn't. He had logged it correctly, handled it with gloves, handed the clipboard to Henderson and walked away. He had done exactly what the job asked. But someone had to find it. Someone had to be in that room at that moment, at the right point in the sweep, with the patience to look behind the garment rack and the care not to damage anything. Someone had to treat it the way it deserved to be treated, not like a discovery, not like a story to tell, but like an item that belonged somewhere and needed to get there. That was the job. That had always been the job. He thought about the woman who had worn that monogram. He thought about the 70 years she had moved through the same corridors he moved through. The same building, the same weight of the stone over you. He thought about the robe sitting in its cedar box for all those years. Kept, cared for, waiting, the way things in the palace waited. He thought about the silk that had come from a farm in Kent, hand-woven, all those decades ago, and the 12 people who had bent over it for 3,500 hours, putting the gold into the velvet, and how none of them could have known, when they were doing it, that it would come back to Westminster Abbey 70 years later and do the same work all over again. He thought it was a good piece of cedar. He thought the catches had been very well made. He thought the fold, the original fold, the one that whoever had put the robe away had made, was one of the best folds he had seen in 31 years of seeing how the palace stored things. There was respect in it. There was the specific care of a person who understood that what they were putting away mattered. Not just now but forward. Not just for them but for whoever would come next. He had refolded it the same way. Before he closed the catches. He had refolded it exactly the way he had found it, because that was the right thing to do with something folded well. Nobody knew that. Nobody would ever know that. That was fine. He finished the sweep. He handed the clipboard to Henderson. He went back to his rotation. The coronation of King Charles III took place on the 6th of May 2023, and it was the first such ceremony in 70 years, and the whole country watched it, and people cried in living rooms and pub gardens and on pavements outside screen shops. The papers wrote about what it meant. The television commentators talked about the continuity of it, the connection between past and present, the way a crown or a robe or a piece of gold embroidery could carry time in it like a river carries water. They talked about Queen Elizabeth's robe being worn again, and the meaning of that, and the intention behind the decision, and what it said about Camilla, and about Charles, and about the royal family's relationship to its own history. They said all of this very well. They did not mention Robert. He did not expect them to. He would not have known what to do if they had. He was the man who checked things. He was the man who walked the corridor. He was the man who found the box and knew what to do with it because he had spent 31 years learning exactly that. He went back to his posting and ran his sweep, northeast to southwest. Every surface, every corner. Good cedar, though. Really very good cedar. He thought about that sometimes, in the months after. When the palace settled back into its ordinary hum, when the robe makers were gone, and the fitting rooms went back to being fitting rooms, and the corridor smelled the way it always smelled. Beeswax, old wood, the particular blank smell of rooms with good ventilation and very little sunlight. He thought about the cedar. He thought about the catches, the good brass catches, the way they had held for 70 years and opened without any resistance at all, like they had been waiting. He supposed they had been. He supposed everything in a palace is waiting, in one way or another, waiting to be used again, or waiting to be seen, or waiting for the right moment to mean something to someone. The robe had waited, the catches had waited, the cedar had done its patient work in the dark, holding things steady, keeping the air clean, making sure that when the lid opened what was inside was still as good as the day it was folded. That was all cedar was. That was all it did. It kept things. Robert Aldred walked the corridor. The building kept on being what it was. Large, old, impossible to know completely, full of rooms that held more than their inventories said, full of objects that had been there longer than the people who walked past them. It had been there before any of them. It would be there after. It kept the things it was given to keep. So did Robert. He just didn't put any of it on the clipboard. The clipboard was for the job. The rest of it, the weight of the robe through cotton gloves, the smell of the cedar, the gold monogram just visible in the fold, the particular silence of a room where something has been kept safe for 70 years. The rest of it he kept himself. He walked the corridor. He was very good at that.